I stood before 150 wedding guests, my hand trembling as I unfolded the small piece of paper my daughter had just slipped into my palm from her bouquet. 3 words, written in her careful handwriting: "Mom, stop this." My daughter Jessica was standing at the altar in her beautiful ivory gown, about to marry Brandon Chen, and she was silently begging me to intervene. Let me back up. My name is Patricia Morrison, and until 18 months ago, I thought I had life figured out. I'm 63 years old, and I live in a lakefront home in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. My late husband Thomas and I bought the property back in 1987 for $62,000. Today, it's worth $4.2 million. We also own a smaller rental property in Spokane and have investment accounts that Thomas carefully built over his 38 years as a petroleum engineer. Thomas passed away 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer. It was sudden, brutal, and it left me alone in a house that suddenly felt too big. But I had Jessica, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, who teaches 3rd grade in Boise and has the kindest heart of anyone I've ever known. Maybe too kind. Jessica met Brandon at a teachers' conference in Sun Valley. He was there representing an educational technology company, giving a presentation on digital learning tools. She came home that weekend absolutely glowing, talking about this brilliant, charming man who shared her passion for education and made her laugh until her sides hurt. "Mom, he's different," she told me over the phone. "He actually listens when I talk about my students. He asks questions. He cares." At 41, Jessica had been single for 5 years after a painful divorce. Her ex-husband had been emotionally distant, more married to his work than to her. So when she met someone who seemed genuinely interested in her life, I understood why she fell so hard, so fast. Brandon came to dinner 2 weeks later. I remember opening the door and seeing him for the first time. He was handsome in that California way, even though he claimed to be from Portland. Perfect teeth, styled hair, expensive watch. He brought flowers, a bottle of wine, and compliments that flowed like water. "Mrs. Morrison?" "Jessica showed me pictures, but they don't do this place justice," he said, stepping into the foyer and looking around. "This is incredible. How long have you lived here?" "Since 1987, I said, taking the flowers. "Wow. Lakefront property in Coeur d'Alene? That must be worth a fortune now." I felt something tighten in my chest. Thomas had always told me, "Patty, never discuss money with people you don't know. Not the house value, not the investments, nothing. Money changes people." "It's been a good home," I said simply. During dinner, Brandon was charming. He asked about my career as a nurse, told funny stories about difficult clients, and seemed genuinely interested in everything. But 3 times during the meal, he circled back to the house. "Do you ever think about selling? I mean, this place must be a lot to maintain. How much land do you have here? 5 acres? 10? The property taxes must be insane. Idaho's gotten so expensive." Each time, Jessica laughed it off. "Brandon, stop talking about real estate. You're not here to appraise my mother's house." But I noticed, and I remembered. The relationship moved quickly, too quickly. Within 3 months, Brandon had moved from Portland to Boise to be closer to Jessica. Within 6 months, he'd proposed with a ring that looked like it cost 3 months' salary. Jessica was over the moon. "He's the one, Mom," she said, showing me the ring with tears in her eyes. I never thought I'd feel this way again. I wanted to be happy for her. I tried to be, but something felt off. Brandon started coming to family dinners every week. And every single week, he'd find a way to bring up my finances. "Jessica mentioned you have a rental property in Spokane. Are you managing it yourself? That must be exhausting at your age. Have you thought about what you'll do with all this when you're gone? Estate planning is so important. I know a great financial advisor if you ever want a second opinion on your investments." One evening, Jessica went to the bathroom during dinner, and Brandon leaned forward with a concerned expression. "Patricia, can I be honest with you? I'm worried about Jessica's financial literacy. She's never really had to think about investments, property management, estate planning. When we get married, I want to make sure she's protected. Maybe we could sit down together and go over your portfolio. I could help her understand what she'll be inheriting someday." The presumption took my breath away. We weren't talking about if I died. We were talking about when and what he, through Jessica, would get. That won't be necessary, I said coldly. He backed off, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. The next incident happened at my annual checkup. I was in the examination room with Dr. Hendricks, who'd been my physician for 15 years, when the nurse poked her head in. Dr. Hendricks, there's a Brandon Chen in the waiting room asking to speak with you about Mrs. Morrison's care. He says he's her daughter's fiancé and has some questions about her cognitive function. My blood ran cold. Dr. Hendricks looked at me, eyebrows raised. Did you ask him to be here? Absolutely not. I'll handle this, she said, and left the room. When I came out 20 minutes later, Brandon was gone, but Dr. Hendricks pulled me aside. Patricia, he was asking very specific questions. Whether you'd shown signs of memory loss, confusion, difficulty managing finances. He claimed Jessica was concerned but too afraid to ask directly. Jessica has never expressed any such concern because there's nothing to be concerned about. I told him I couldn't discuss your medical information without your written consent, and that you seemed perfectly cognitively intact to me. But Patricia, this is a red flag. A big one. I drove home in a daze. Why would Brandon be asking about my mental competency? The answer came to me as I pulled into my driveway and looked at my beautiful lakefront property. He was building a case. If he could establish that I was mentally declining, he could influence Jessica to seek power of attorney, maybe even conservatorship. And once he had legal control over my finances through my daughter, I called Jessica that night. Sweetheart, did you ask Brandon to talk to Dr. Hendricks about me? There was a long pause. What? No. Why would I? Wait. He talked to Dr. Hendricks? I explained what happened. Jessica sounded genuinely shocked. Mom, I swear I didn't know anything about this. Let me talk to him. Whatever conversation they had, Brandon must have been convincing, because the next time I saw Jessica, she seemed more confused than angry. He said he was just concerned because you seemed a little forgetful at dinner last week. He thought maybe I hadn't noticed because I don't see you as often as I should. Jessica, I'm not forgetful. I'm 63, not 93, and my mind is sharp. I know, Mom. I told him that. He apologized. He said he overstepped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus Webb, a retired police detective who now ran a small investigation firm in Spokane. I felt ridiculous at first, like I was being paranoid, but Marcus took me seriously. Mrs. Morrison, trust your instincts. 40 years in law enforcement taught me that when something feels wrong, it usually is. It took Marcus 3 weeks to compile his report. When he called me to come to his office, his voice was grim. The folder he handed me was 2 inches thick. Brandon Chen wasn't from Portland. He was from Sacramento, and his real last name wasn't Chen, it was Cheney. He'd been engaged twice before, both times to women over 60. Both widows, both with substantial assets. The first woman, Margaret Sullivan from Eugene, Oregon, had broken off the engagement after her son discovered Brandon trying to add himself to her bank accounts. She'd filed for a restraining order. The second woman, Dorothy Park from Tacoma, Washington, had actually married him. 6 months later, she'd been declared mentally incompetent by a doctor Brandon had found. Brandon had been granted power of attorney. Within a year, Dorothy's house had been sold, her investments liquidated, and she'd been moved into a nursing home. Her children were still fighting in court to recover the money. Dorothy had early-onset Alzheimer's. But according to medical records Marcus had obtained, she'd been completely lucid when she married Brandon. Her decline had been suspiciously rapid. There was more. Brandon's educational technology company barely existed. It was a shell corporation with no real clients, no office, nothing but a website and business cards. The presentation he'd given at the conference where he met Jessica, he'd stolen it from an actual educational technology company and presented it as his own work. Everything about him was a lie. I sat in Marcus's office, staring at photographs of Brandon with these other women, court documents, medical records, and felt sick. What do? I whispered. You tell your daughter, Marcus said. Today, I tried. God knows I tried. I called Jessica and asked her to come over. I laid out everything, The folder, the photographs, the court documents. I begged her to see the truth. She cried. She shouted. She accused me of being jealous, of trying to control her life, of hiring a private investigator because I couldn't stand to see her happy. "You never liked him," she screamed. "From the very beginning, you looked at him like he was dirt on your shoe." "Jessica, please, just look at the evidence. Evidence you paid someone to fabricate." "Mom, this is insane. Brandon loves me. He wants to build a life with me. He wants your inheritance." "I don't have an inheritance yet because you're not dead. Do you hear yourself? You sound paranoid." She left, slamming the door so hard a picture frame fell off the wall. For 2 weeks, she wouldn't take my calls. Brandon had convinced her I was jealous, controlling, possibly even experiencing early dementia myself. He'd twisted everything. I was losing my daughter. The wedding was planned for October at a beautiful vineyard outside Boise. Jessica had thrown herself into the preparations, posting pictures on social media, shopping for dresses, taste-testing cakes. She looked happy in the photos, but I could see the strain around her eyes. She finally called me 3 weeks before the wedding. "Mom, I want you there. Despite everything, you're still my mother, but I need you to promise you won't make a scene." "Jessica, promise me, Mom, Brandon is going to be my husband. If you can't accept that, then don't come." I promised. What else could I do? But I also contacted Marcus again. "I need more," I told him. "Something concrete. Something she can't deny." Marcus got to work. He found something even I hadn't expected. Brandon had a prescription for lorazepam, a sedative, filled at 3 different pharmacies under slightly different names. The dosages didn't match any medical necessity. And according to Marcus's contact at one of the pharmacies, Brandon had asked specifically about how the medication could be mixed with alcohol, claiming his elderly mother sometimes needed help sleeping. Brandon didn't have an elderly mother. She died 10 years ago. Marcus also found security footage from a bar in Boise where Brandon had met with another man twice in the past month. The man was a disbarred lawyer named Gregory Sims, who specialized in elder exploitation cases, usually defending the exploiters. The wedding day arrived. I hadn't slept the night before. I'd rehearsed what I would do 100 times, but now, sitting in the 3rd row of white chairs at the vineyard, watching Jessica walk down the aisle on the arm of her uncle, I felt paralyzed. She looked beautiful, radiant. The smile on her face was genuine, even if I could see the slight tremor in her hands. Brandon stood at the altar in his perfect suit, his perfect hair, his perfect smile. Looking at him made my skin crawl. The ceremony began. The officiant welcomed everyone, talked about love and commitment and partnership. Jessica and Brandon exchanged vows they'd written themselves. Hers were beautiful, heartfelt, real. His sounded like they'd been pulled from a greeting card. Then came the exchange of rings. As the officiant asked for the rings, Jessica turned to her maid of honor to hand over her bouquet. That's when our eyes met. I saw it. The fear, the doubt, the silent plea. She walked toward me, holding out the bouquet. "Mom, would you hold this for me for just a moment?" Everyone thought it was sweet, a moment between mother and daughter. But as she placed the bouquet in my hands, I felt the paper tucked between the stems. I waited until she turned back to Brandon before I pulled it out. 3 words in her handwriting. "Mom, stop this." Time seemed to slow down. The officiant was saying something about marriage being a sacred bond. Brandon was slipping the ring onto Jessica's finger, his smile wide and triumphant. I thought about Dorothy Park in her nursing home, her children fighting to reclaim what had been stolen. I thought about Margaret Sullivan and her restraining order. I thought about the lorazepam prescriptions and the meetings with the disbarred lawyer. I thought about Jessica, my beautiful daughter, silently begging me to save her, even though she couldn't admit she needed saving. I stood up. The movement was sudden enough that people turned to look. The officiant paused mid-sentence. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice carrying across the silent vineyard. "I can't let this continue." Jessica's eyes widened. Brandon's smile faltered. "Mrs. Morrison," the officiant said gently, "perhaps you should sit down." No, I don't think I will." I walked toward the altar, my heart pounding. Brandon, or should I say Brandon Chaney, I think it's time everyone here knew who you really are." His face went pale, then red. "This is inappropriate. Patricia, you're making a scene." "You're damn right I am." I turned to the guests. "This man is not who he claims to be. His real name is Brandon Chaney, and he's a con artist who targets widows for their money." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jessica looked like she might faint. "Mom, what are you doing?" she whispered. "Saving you." I pulled out my phone, where I'd saved photos of Marcus's report. This man has been engaged to at least 2 other women, both widows over 60. One of them, Dorothy Park, is now in a nursing home after being declared mentally incompetent shortly after marrying him. Her assets were liquidated, and her family is still fighting in court. I held up my phone, showing Dorothy's photo. "He showed up at my doctor's office asking about my cognitive function. He's been pressuring me about my estate planning since the day we met. And I have evidence that he's been stockpiling sedatives and meeting with a disbarred lawyer who specializes in elder exploitation." Brandon lunged toward me, but Jessica's uncle and 2 groomsmen grabbed him. "You crazy bitch," he snarled, all pretense of charm gone. "You've been trying to poison her against me from day one because you can't stand that someone else might make her happy. Is that why my daughter just handed me a note begging me to stop this wedding?" I held up the paper. "Because I'm the problem?" Everyone looked at Jessica. Tears were streaming down her face. "Is that true, Jessica?" her maid of honor asked gently. Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't say no myself. I thought maybe I was crazy, maybe Mom was right, but I'd already sent the invitations and bought the dress, and everyone was here, and I thought maybe if I just went through with it, everything would be fine. But then I was standing up there and I realized I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think, and all I could think was that I needed my mom." She turned to Brandon, her voice growing stronger. "You did ask about Mom's mental health. You did talk about her assets constantly. And last week, when I told you I wanted to postpone the wedding, you gave me tea that made me so drowsy I could barely drive home. You said it was just chamomile, but it wasn't, was it?" Brandon's expression turned ugly. "You're both insane. This whole family is insane." "No," said a voice from the back. Marcus Webb walked up the aisle, and he wasn't alone. 2 police officers followed him. "But you are under investigation. Mr. Chaney. These officers have some questions about your activities in Oregon and Washington. Seems there are some warrants out for your arrest." The wedding dissolved into chaos. Guests were crying, talking, taking pictures. Brandon was being led away in handcuffs, screaming about false accusations and lawsuits. Jessica collapsed into my arms, sobbing. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I didn't want to believe you. He made everything sound so reasonable, and he made me feel so special, and I thought maybe you were just being overprotective." "Shh, baby. It's okay. You're okay now. I knew something was wrong. Deep down, I knew, but I was so afraid of being alone again." "You're not alone. You have me. You'll always have me." The aftermath took months to sort out. Brandon was charged in Washington with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult regarding Dorothy Park. Additional charges were pending in Oregon. Jessica went to therapy to process what had happened, what she'd almost done. 6 months later, we were sitting on my deck overlooking the lake, drinking wine and watching the sunset. "I should have listened to you earlier," Jessica said. "You listened when it mattered most," I replied. "That note you gave me, that took incredible courage. I was terrified. Right up until the moment I handed you the bouquet, I wasn't sure I'd go through with it. Part of me wanted to just take the ring and hope for the best." "What changed?" I looked at him standing there, and I realized his smile looked exactly like it did the first time he asked about your house. It was the same calculated smile. Everything with him was calculated. Nothing was real. We sat in silence for a while, watching the light fade over the water. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "How did you know?" "From the very beginning. How did you know?" I thought about it. "Your father used to say that people who are genuinely interested in you ask about your life, your feelings, your experiences. People who want something from you ask about your things. Brandon only ever asked about things. The house, the property, the investments. Never about your students, your hobbies, your dreams. I told myself he was just practical. Financial planning is important. It is, but it's not romantic. And it's definitely not appropriate to discuss with your fiancé's mother within 10 minutes of meeting her. Jessica laughed, a real laugh this time. God, I was such an idiot. No. You were lonely and hopeful and human. That's not idiotic. That's brave. What happened to Dorothy? The woman in the nursing home? Her children won the case. Most of the money was recovered. She's in a better facility now, getting proper care. And Brandon will be in prison for at least 5 years, probably longer once all the charges shake out. Good. Jessica's voice was fierce. He deserves worse. We talked until the stars came out, about life and love and trust, and everything in between. Later, as Jessica was getting ready to leave, she hugged me tight. Thank you for standing up, she whispered. Even when I told you not to. Even when I hated you for it. Thank you for standing up anyway. That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We stand up when our children can't. After she left, I stood on my deck alone, looking at the lake Thomas and I had loved so much. I thought about the note Jessica had slipped into my hand, 3 desperate words that changed everything. Sometimes love means saying no when everyone expects you to say yes. Sometimes it means standing up when you're supposed to sit down. Sometimes it means being the villain in the story so your child doesn't become the victim. I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, because that's what mothers do. We protect, we fight, we stand up, even and especially when it costs us everything.